Hello, I'm Neil McGregor, and this is Germany, Memories of a Nation from BBC Radio 4. The Second World War deployed some of the most advanced technology yet known to man. And by 1945 it had laid waste to much of Germany and of Europe. So all that ordinary people had left to escape the conquering armies with was old technology. There were no cars, lorries or buses. Essentially, there were just wooden carts, if they were lucky. And I'm standing now in the German Historical Museum in Berlin, beside one of these hand-pulled carts, which had been dragged from Pomerania, in what's now Poland, into Germany at the end of 1945. It's about the size and the shape of a child's cot, and it looks indeed a bit like a child's cot sat on four wheels. It's roughly made out of crudely hewn wood, and it's got a handle to pull it by. It's the kind of farm cart that's been used for centuries to carry cabbages and potatoes from the field to the barn and from the barn to the market. And like so many traditional farm implements, it's extremely hard to date. In fact, a cart like this, it seems to me, could very well have been used for exactly similar purposes in the 17th century during the 30 Years' War. Piled high with bedding, clothes and food, there would be very little space to carry anything else from the farms, the towns, where the refugees and their families before them had lived for centuries. Before 1945, in what was then Prussia and Pomerania, people could be shot on sight for using one of these carts. To flee to the west was weakness, capitulation. It was absolutely forbidden. But once even the German army began to pull back in the face of the Soviet advance, the civilians fled. Millions of them just upped and left everything behind that they could not carry or pile onto one of these carts. Mile after mile of so-called displaced persons, hoping to stay just a few steps ahead of the advancing and avenging soldiers from the east. This was just the beginning of what was to become Europe's worst refugee crisis ever. The biggest forced population movement in history. It was larger than anything that had happened in Stalin's Russia or even during the partition of India and Pakistan, and most of these people had nowhere to go. In Britain, little is known about this. In Germany, it's part of almost every family's history. But this was not just people fleeing from advancing armies. This was also the result of hard-nosed negotiations between the Allies, the victors over Germany. At the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, the USSR, the US and the UK redrew the map of Europe. The Baltic states fell under Soviet control. The borders of Poland were moved hundreds of miles to the west. The Sudetenland returned to Czechoslovakia, and Königsberg became part of the Soviet Union. Everywhere, German-speaking people, even if they'd been settled in their lands for centuries, became objects of hatred and persecution. To avoid an explosion of ethnic killing, the occupying powers saw only one solution.
The three governments, having considered the question in all its aspects, recognised that the transfer to Germany of German populations or elements thereof remaining in Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary will have to be undertaken. They agree that any transfers that take place should be effected in an orderly and humane manner.
Behind the bland words was a brutally simple fact. People who spoke German would be moved to what was now deemed to be German territory, if necessary, against their will. As Churchill put it, this would be the most satisfactory and lasting solution.
There will be no mixture of populations to cause endless trouble. A clean sweep will be made.
That clean sweep brings us back to this handcart. Andreas Kossert is a historian of those post-war expulsions, and he works in Berlin with the German Historical Museum.
It's a universal material expression of having been forced to leave your home. This was mostly used in spring and summer 1945, when already Polish or Czech authorities legalized the expulsion of German civilians. We call it the phase of wild expulsions just before the Potsdam Treaty in August 1945, where Polish authorities actually wanted already to get rid of as many Germans as possible, so in order to have a better stand in their negotiation process at Potsdam.
Have we any idea how many people were actually moved from the territories east of modern Germany?
Up to 14 million Germans. 14 million Germans were expelled and lost their homes, which meant at the end of the war that 1/4 of all Germans were victims of expulsion or flight, having lost their homes. And altogether, 1/4 of German territory was lost in 1945.
Much of that territory had been German for centuries, but there were also large, long-settled German populations from outside Germany, from the Baltic states, from Romania, Poland, and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And all of them were now forcibly assimilated into the 3/4 of the country that remained, in parts of Germany which they had never seen before, or perhaps never even heard of. Much of that Germany was in ruins, barely able to accommodate its own returning population. Unsurprisingly, the immigrants were not at all welcome. They may all have been of German descent, but after centuries of separation, many of them had habits that seemed alien. They spoke funny German, they ate funny food, they behaved in a strange way. Above all, they were competing for scant resources. But there was an extra edge to the tensions. Andreas Kossert.
The arrival of the Germans from the east was a reminder for all Germans that they all lost the war together. But the refugees, of course, they had no return ticket. So it meant they were staying there forever. There was a very intense social conflict between West Germans who actually tried to forget as soon as possible about their own responsibilities during the war, and refugees about who lost the war, why were we the ones who were expelled, and you could still sit in your farms and in your social environment you are so used to, and why did we pay the bill for Hitler?
A few yards away from the refugee handcart is another wagon, also designed to be pulled by hand, also surrounded by scenes of recent warfare and evident displacement. But this handcart is much smaller, because this is the model for the stage set for the first performance in Berlin in 1949 of one of the most famous German plays of the 20th century, Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage.
Ihr Hauptleut, lasst die Trommel ruhen.
Brecht fled Nazi Germany in 1933, and in 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, he was in Stockholm.
Mutter Courage.
Brecht's response to the outbreak of war was to write perhaps this most famous of his plays, certainly one of his most performed, Mutter Courage und ihre Kinder, Mother Courage and Her Children, was set not in the present day, but in the 30 Years' War, a conflict which in the 17th century had devastated Germany and traumatised its people. Brecht wrote the play in a matter of weeks, as Hitler's armies and aeroplanes smashed their way across Poland. He intended it to be a condemnation of all war, and he used the 30 Years' War as the setting, precisely because it had so nearly destroyed the very idea of Germany 300 years earlier. Brecht was reacting to what he saw happening in 1939, but with disconcerting prescience, he was writing a drama that would be played out in real life by millions over the next 10 years. Mother Courage is an archetypal figure, a camp follower selling food and other necessities to soldiers. She's a black marketeer, a war profiteer. Her wagon, essential to her business, dominates the play. It rolls from scene to scene. Unlike Mother Courage's children, it outlives everything. By the end of the play, Mother Courage, dehumanized by war, morally emptied, has almost become one with her wagon. Both are merely machines for survival, for profit, for keeping going.
Brecht is very wisely undermining the classical role of the heroine as being somebody whose moral compass you might choose to follow. by having a woman whose self-survival on the surface is the only thing that matters to her, but in fact, of course, she's emotionally not surviving.
Fiona Shaw, one of the most powerful interpreters of the role.
The value of survival does erode people's expectations of how well they can live. And you meet people in Mother Courage, whether you're performing it in 2014 or whether you're performing it in 1945, who you would hope not to meet normally. Mother Courage gets very rich, and in a way we feel good that she's doing well, but it's terrible why she's doing well. And it is this constant pull that is asking us what we feel about ourselves. At the very end, she's just been off doing a little deal somewhere, and she comes back and finds that her daughter, Catherine, has been shot. Her last child is now dead, so she's alone, and she could buckle, and perhaps then we would feel sorry for her. But she doesn't feel sorry for herself. She ties herself to the cart and drags it yet again, following the soldiers, but it is to no end. And there's an existential issue here, I think. There is no God, there's no religious future, there's no emotional future, and yet she pulls the cart. And I find it hard to believe that Brecht isn't sympathetic to that problem for us.
It staggers to its feet again.
Brecht's aim to show Mother Courage as a knowing participant in the evil business of war, little better than the warmongers and the looters themselves, was lost on the audience when the play was first performed in Berlin in 1949. To his irritation, they saw above all her suffering and her failure, and they were moved to compassion, as indeed are most theatre-goers to this day. And yet, 70 years on since the end of the war, the millions of expellees from Eastern Europe, just like the huge numbers of victims killed in the bombing of German cities, remain strikingly under-commemorated and understudied. Is this because Germans consider these events as their just retribution for the evil deeds of the Third Reich? Perhaps. But the suffering cannot be denied. The pathos of the handcart is powerful and real. The expellees force the awkward question. When a state has done so much wrong, how are we to respond to the suffering its citizens endure as a result? If we assert a communal guilt, can we nonetheless plead for individual compassion? It's a topic which preoccupies Andreas Kossert.
I think there's still so much more to be done on what it means for German collective memory. I think it's only slowly becoming a topic of collective memory in Germany, because until very recently it was reserved for, let's say, a right-wing, revisionist, politically not very correct part of society, or this was the general perception. For instance, in a family there was total silence and not a word about the loss or about the mourning of parents or grandparents. But all of a sudden it's entering the center of society. And I think what really made Germans more aware of their own history was the conflict in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. We watched expulsions on television screens in Germany, and all of a sudden we realized it was part of our own experience. And I think this made also people more aware, even politicians, that we had to take action, because ethnic cleansings cannot be justified as an instrument to appease conflicts or wars.
Here, as in other areas of German experience, memories long suppressed are awakening. But the millions of refugees that had to be assimilated into what remained of Germany at the end of the war were not just victims. They brought with them skills and technologies, knowledge and labour, valuable assets for rebuilding both the cities and the economy. And that rebuilding, astonishing in its completeness and its speed, is the subject of the next programme. For details of more programmes about Germany available on the BBC, or to see the objects and buildings featured in this series, search online for Germany, Memories of a Nation.